24-year-old man walks into a hospital and announces that he has misplaced his aeroplane. He was sure he'd left it parked in the car park. Has anyone seen it? A 64-year-old woman is in a hospital bed when a visitor stops by her bed. The woman begins to scream. She's terrified of the visitor. She's screaming bloody murder and has to be injected in order to calm down. The visitor is her daughter. A 34-year-old husband looks at his wife of 10 years and asks what her name is. Bodies, brains, we all have them. They're all different, but we own them, right? What happens when our bodies and our brains become compromised? What if our bodies were no longer ours? What can we control and what can't we control? What if someone else owned a part of you or someone else controlled your mind? Ask yourself this. Who does your body and brain belong to? Welcome to Extraordinary Stories Podcast. Hey, how are you? Are you well? Are you good? I am. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick shout out before I get on with the story. I'm just going to shout out a few of the wonderful Twitter community who've been very lovely of late. So Pod Conglomerate, the Pod Place, and Podcast Recommendations for shouting loudly about extraordinary stories. Thank you very much. Alright, so we're on to number 4 in the Body and Brains series. And it's the brain that's the subject in this episode. And, well, if I was an American, I would say this is a real doozy of a story. But I'm not. I'm not an American. So I'll say it's mental. It's pure madness. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. Beth Cox is tired. She is very, very tired. She has a baby, and the baby isn't sleeping. Now, the baby is 6 months old. So, she wakes up slowly, and, well, the day ahead, it's going to be the same routine. She's going to get up, she's going to sort out the baby, sort out her home, and she's going to see what's going on with her husband, Wesley. And then she'll get on with the day. Beth lives in a small ranch with her family. But this isn't going to be a day like any other. This is going to be day 1 of a bizarre and confusing life for Beth Cox. Now, her husband, Wesley, Right, he works as a youth and family minister at the local church in San Antonio, Texas. Yeehaw! And Wesley, he, as well as doing that at the church, he's also studying, and he's about to complete his doctoral degree at the Texas Tech University. So this is 1984, and Beth and Wesley, well, they've been married a couple of years now, and after, I think it's 2 years of being married, Beth finally fell pregnant, and they had their baby daughter. So since their daughter's come along, it's been hard work to keep their house in order, keep everything going, Wesley to keep up with his church duties, his busy schedule, studying. He's working with a lot of families and a lot of young people in the area, so it's hectic, it's busy. Now, Wesley's quite well known around the area. In fact, both Beth and Wesley are, they know a lot of people. But especially because of his work with the church, they're quite well known. So the day before this day that I'm describing for Beth, where had Wesley been? Well, he'd been away for most of the day. And the reason is that he had to drive to Texas Tech University, which is about a 7-hour drive from their home. And the reason he had to go there was because he had to hand in his final dissertation at the university. Now, his plan was hand in the dissertation and then drive straight home to his wife and baby. So in the evening, he calls Beth. He calls her to say, "That's me, handed it in, I'm leaving, and I will be home in the morning." So his plan is to drive through the night and be back when Beth wakes up the next day. Waking up on that day in 1984, Beth has no idea that her husband Wesley, as she knew him, would be gone for good. He called her to say he was set to drive home, but Wesley Barcox vanished into thin air, leaving behind his family, his wife, and his baby. Now, we know from listening to stories, listening to podcasts, what we see in the news, documentaries, people don't just vanish into thin air. Well, they do, right? They do vanish into thin air. But there's usually some kind of trace. There's normally like someone has seen them. Or there's something, a clue, a sighting, a bit of CCTV, something that can help when a person just vanishes. But in the case of Wesley Cox, nothing. After the phone call to say, "I'm leaving the university, I'm driving through the night," nothing. A huge search is undertaken by police. Roads, wasteland, that whole journey that he took from Texas Tech University to his house, it was searched. Had he driven off the road into some ditch somewhere? No. Had he been kidnapped and taken to another part of Texas? Well, years and years of not wanted posters, and searches and news reports would lead you to say no. Wesley's father was a wealthy oil man. I don't know what the term for that is. Oil man's not right. Oiler. Oil salesman. Oil tycoon. You know what I'm getting at. Basically, he's an episode of Dallas, right? That's what I'm trying to say. So, very, very wealthy. He hires a private detective, and he uses his own private plane to travel all over the state of Texas searching for his son. Now, he pays Wesley's father for a search that involves 300 volunteers a day. It involves dogs, and this search would cover 10,000 miles. It turns up nothing. So, Beth and her baby, what do? Well, for years and years the search continues. Where has Wesley Cox gone? 9 years pass. And it comes to the point where the family decide they're going to have to do something here. And what they decide to do is register him dead. Although they had him officially registered dead, there still remains in his elderly parents and in his wife, and his young child, that tiny, tiny bit of hope that he might one day show up. But as the years went on, and it starts to get towards the mid-90s, he's been gone so long that hope is fading fast. In 1999, in Dallas, Texas, there is a very serious meeting going on inside the White Rock Community Church. I say meeting, it's more of an interview. Right, let me explain a little bit about this church, the White Rock Community. So it's got a really large congregation, and it pulls in from all over parts of Dallas. And it's got a particular focus on lesbian and gay members. It sees itself as a church which will accept all kinds of sexuality and ways of living your life with open arms. Now, it's been around for years and years, and its central headquarters is in this really grand building in Dallas, where it hosts most of its kind of meetings, certainly its bigger weekly meetings, and there can be up to 600 members at a time at these meetings. Now, in 1999, the church are looking for someone to fill a very important role. They're looking to appoint a senior pastor, a very really, really important role in running the church, someone who will lead sermons and services, be dedicated to the congregation, organise the discos and the Liza Minnelli tribute nights. I'm kidding. Right, so here are the specific requirements for this role. I actually made myself laugh there with my own Liza Minnelli joke. Oh my god, what a loser. The person who gets this job, the senior pastor, must have a strong belief in the message that the church is open and welcoming, be a good leader, and of course, be gay. So, in 1999, when Bill Jones, who is a current pastor, is sitting across the table from a prospective fellow who wants the job, he is really intrigued by this man. This man goes by the name of James Simmons. Now, James Simmons, he's been around the church for a few months now, and he's gotten the attention of the congregation. Really for the reasons that, first of all, he's new, so that's going to bring some interest. Also, he's charismatic. He's a storyteller. He's a nice guy. But here's the thing. when you really get down to the nuts and the bolts, the thing that creates a fascination with James is this. It's his story, because it's wild. James Simmons has been invited to a dinner with some of the church elders and a few of the congregation. And the reason that he's invited to this dinner is to tell his story to this gathering of people at this party. James tells the guests that first and foremost, his name isn't James Simmons, but it is the name that he goes by. So the guests at the party ask, well, what is your name then? He says, I don't know. So they say, well, how did you come by James Simmons? And he says, well, the people who took me in called me John Doe. And over time, John became Jimmy. We've talked about this before, haven't we? You know, John becomes Jimmy, Betty becomes Sally, Frankie becomes Nadine. You know, people just make things up with their names. So the party guests ask quite rightly, what do you mean took you in? What family? What are you going on about? James Simmons is talking about waking up in the trunk of an abandoned car, discovered by a group of kids who had been playing nearby. He tells them of waking up, realising he was in a car and shouting for help, screaming, before the nearby kids who were kicking a ball about opened the trunk and James saw daylight. He tells them he got out, he wandered around in a daze, his head covered in blood, his body beaten, and he tells them he just started crawling. Where he didn't know, and towards what he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure of anything except that he had been beaten in such a bad way that he couldn't walk properly or talk properly. He tells the guests at the party who are listening so intently that he stumbled towards a medical facility where he was taken in. So the guy who's hosting this party, Bill, the guy who was interviewing him for the job, he is loving this. Because you see, James has already told Bill all of this in private at the job interview, and he wants the rest of the congregation to know it. Because here's what he's thinking. He thinks if people hear James Simmons' story, they are definitely going to give him this job as a senior pastor. He's going to be such an amazing leader of this church because he is a miracle. A miracle sent down from heaven. I mean, he really believes he is an actual miracle, brought from the brink of death, found in a car, almost dead years before. And here he stands today, a picture of health with a story to tell. So naturally, the guests have more questions. Oh my God, if I was there, I'd be like, everyone shut up, I'm asking the questions. I'd be like kicking folk out the road. Excuse me, talk to me. Just me, no one else. So James goes on. He tells them that he spent weeks in the medical facility and that during that time he learns to walk again and to talk again. And he remembers one other thing about this medical facility. He remembers that he really fancied the male nurse who was teaching him how to walk again. And as he says this, he winks at the party guests. Playing to the crowd, James, I think you are. He knows his audience. So he continues. He says he left the hospital and then he set out for California where he set himself up a new life. But wait, one goddamn minute. The guests want to know the answer to this question. What about your family? What family? Says James. I don't know if I have a family. I don't remember anyone looking for me. I don't know who they are. I don't know where they are. I didn't know then, and I still don't know now. I have no idea. He says at the hospital they had nothing to identify me. The car that I was found in didn't belong to me, so I was a John Doe. And I have no memory of a family. In the mid-1980s, he says, I was a nameless man wandering on my own. James will go on to tell the guests that he is angry that his family have never tracked him down, never attempted to find him. So they ask, what happened next? Where did you go? What did you do? And he says, well, the private medical facility, they gave me a little amount of cash. They sent me on my way. And I crossed paths with a man called Pastor Brown. This would be 1986, he remembers. Pastor Brown kindly took him in, cared for him. And James goes to lengths to emphasise to the people listening that this was the beginning of his life as he sees it. There is no life for him before the hospital. He says that after there, he left and was kindly taken in by a landlady who had room to spare and saw him as someone to be pitied. And she says to him, well, look, you can't just wander around with the name James. You need a surname. Let's get you sorted out. Let's get you a social security number. Let's get you actually registered as a human being. So now this bit all becomes a bit confusing. He says that the landlady calls around and gets him a social security number. I mean, how? As far as I know, I don't think you can just do that. Even in 1986, don't think you could just call about. But James says this is what happened. So the guests, they continue to listen. From here, James tells them that he goes to a church in San Francisco. If you're going to San Francisco. And when he gets there, he takes a position within a church. And this is where he quickly lays down some roots. So, in James's timeline, this would be 1991. 5 years on from being found in the trunk of that car. And at this church in San Francisco, well, he is a big hit. Oh, he's busy. He takes on volunteer work at the local hospital. He becomes an AIDS counsellor. He works in prisons. He works with senior citizens, youths, singles. Oh my God, he does the whole lot. He ends up at one point taking on a job within the church where he's dealing with members of the congregation's finances. He's helping them to sort of get back on track if they've lost their way with money. So he's really big within this church. Now, one thing that he doesn't do, this church, is he doesn't tell them he's gay. He's worried that they might reject him for this, so he keeps this information to himself. And then he says the time comes and he leaves San Francisco and he finds himself in Dallas at the White Rock Church. And that brings us up to here and now. Him sitting at this party telling everyone his story. The elders will say, a modern miracle. That is what you're looking at. He was looking for a family for all these years, and he found one. He found one in the White Rock Church. So the one big question is this. Would the congregation vote? And would they give him this powerful position of senior pastor? Now that they know his story, does that just make him even more exciting? And so the congregation vote. 2/3 vote to give him the position. And he becomes senior pastor. Congregation members will say this kind of thing of James. He is so charming, I tell you. He could say the sky was red, and if you disagreed with him, he'd pretty soon have you believing the sky was red. Always makes me nervous when people say that about other people. Oh, you could sell ice cubes to the Eskimos. No, is that the phrase? But you know what I'm talking about. That one. Oh, you could sell oil to the Texans. I'm just making things up now, but you know the kind of thing I mean. I don't know. It always says untrustworthy to me. Other people in the congregation will say he has a magnetic personality. I don't know how to describe it, but in his presence, you're in love with him. You're in awe of him. Everyone is. And that's another danger for me. So, anyway, he's in this position. And it's the year 2000 now. And Pastor Simmons, he gets up on the altar every week and he gives his sermons to around about 300, sometimes 400 people who crowd into that church on a Sunday to hear him speak. Now, on one random Sunday in 2000, it's not a particularly special day, it's just another Sunday, another sermon. There's a guy who wanders into the church. Now, this is not his normal church. The guy is from Texas. He's actually from San Antonio, to be exact. But he's passing through Dallas. He sees the White Rock Church. It's a Sunday, and he thinks, I'll pop in here for a sermon. As James Simmons steps up to address the congregation, the stranger in the crowd thinks, I'm going to faint. He starts to think he's seen a ghost. He says to himself, that's Wesley Cox up there. This man knows this is Wesley Cox because he lived only a few miles away from him and his family back in San Antonio. Now this is 16 years after Wesley has disappeared, but the man in the crowd is so sure that this is him. But he doesn't say anything. He sits through the service. He stares at this man that he knows, but he doesn't say a word. He leaves and he takes his thoughts with him. Now remember I said 2/3 of the congregation had voted for James to be this senior pastor. Well, what about the 1/3 who didn't vote for James in this role? Well, there was a reason, and simply put, they just didn't buy the amnesia story. They were not trusting of him. They had doubts that he was this miracle that they were told that he was. And we all know what happens when there is distrust, untrust, whatever it's called, mistrust, fuck's sake, what's the word? Not trust. Basically, they thought he was a liar. Gossip, whispers, rumours. That's what happens, and there is always someone who wants to dig up the truth. So members of the congregation, they start asking questions about James's sudden appearance and the story he's had to tell. Now, the other ones who do believe James, they're like, shut up, he is a modern miracle. So don't be trying to pick holes in his story. But before long, the part of the congregation who don't really believe what he's got to say, they go to the newspapers and they ask them if they'll do a bit of detective work on the new guy in town. What this leads to is a TV news report, and it's really interesting because all the hosts in this, they all sort of sit around raising their eyebrows at the odd story. They just think, this doesn't add up. This isn't sounding right. So with a little bit of publicity around it, James Simmons, he's forced to speak up. And he says this, look, I know there will be doubters, but I can tell you hand on heart, I am telling the truth. Okay? One of the things that no one was doubting was James's gayness. He was a one-man pride parade. So that's not in question. It's just his story. His life, basically. So it all gets a little bit heated, and James gets forced into doing a press conference. Because you see, this is quite a big church he leads, and there's a lot of people involved, and they want answers. Now, those who did believe the story are beginning to go, hang on, have I been fooled here? Have I been told a set of lies? So at the press conference, James is asked to repeat his story, the one he told at the party, the story he's been telling everyone, and it starts to change. He starts to say this, I was told that I was discovered in the trunk of a car and that I couldn't walk or talk. All I remember was being aware that I was in Tallahassee and thinking to myself, look at me, I'm hitchhiking across America. Huh? Okay. He continues, they told me at the hospital I had amnesia and that I was lucky to be alive. Right. So the questions start, where is this hospital? No idea, says James. It might have been east of the Mississippi River, or perhaps west. Well, that shouldn't take too long to search. I mean, the Mississippi's tiny. That would only take a couple hours to figure that out. Shut up. Pressed for more details about the hospital, he says, I can remember very little, except that they sent me on my way with money. He said, I've always said it was a clinic, a private clinic. It's perfectly possible they may have given me a small bag of money. And I don't know what the institution was. As I've said a million times, my first memory was that I was hitchhiking across Tennessee. But it wasn't, because you said Tallahassee. Okay. They ask, let's talk about Pastor Brown, the man that you supposedly were taken in by, and then the kindly landlady who sorted you out your social security. Where do they reside? Not sure, says James. It's just all so foggy. Those early days, I can't remember. Police, at this point, go back through the records and they do a thorough search of their files. No one ever reported a man wandering into a hospital with no memory of who he was in 1984. No records show that a car was ever found abandoned with evidence of blood in the trunk. This hospital that he describes cannot be located. There is no random private medical facility in the middle of nowhere. And then, of course, the question that it keeps coming back to, you have no memory of a family. Yes? None, says James. He says, I know that you want the details. I know that you want documentation. And I know that many of you do not believe and that there are skeptics out there. And that's what I have to deal with. Oh yeah, there are skeptics out there, of course there are. But there's also a couple of other people who are very interested in this story. His wife Beth and his daughter. James is told that his wife and his daughter will be visiting him in Dallas, and he has no idea what to think or what to do except wait for them to arrive. And he does. And when they arrive, he looks at Beth. He looks at his daughter, who's now a grown-up teenager, and he doesn't recognise either of them. He says he's never seen them in his life. Beth Cox is staring at the man she married, the father of her child, and he says he doesn't know her. The following day, Beth and her daughter, they return to San Antonio, and they carry on their life the way that they always had, without Wesley. Now, it's interesting because James believes them when they say, "We are your family." Like, he believes Beth when she says, "I am your wife." But he has no memory of them, so he's not about to step back into a life with a wife and a child. I mean, certainly not. Here he is being this fabulous gay pastor. You know, he's too busy putting on his hot pants and his disco music. You know, he doesn't want to be stepping back into that life. Amnesia is such a complicated and debated condition within neuroscience. And although, you know, there is hundreds of evidence around to support what doctors know, doctors are also really quick to warn, we don't know everything about it. But what we do know is this: it's not what you see on TV and in films. Very rarely is a person's memory completely erased and just written over. It just doesn't happen like that. Yes, people do forget things. Of course, people don't recognise their family and they don't recognise their surroundings. But over time, tiny fragments will return. They might not make any sense, but they do return. But James Simmons is claiming that his life as Wesley Cox is 100% gone. He remembers nothing. Just to add further complication, Beth Cox, in the years after he went missing and they had announced him dead, she cashed in his life insurance, and I mean, it was quite modest, but she had about $300, $400 a month coming in. And now it's still unclear if she may have to repay that money now that her husband has been found alive. James Simmons calls his wife and his daughter on their birthdays, and he sends gifts at Christmas, but that is as far as the relationship goes. He's continued in his role as senior pastor at the church, and in 2004 moved into a swanky house in Dallas, paid for by the church. James Simmons gets to live his best life. He has a senior position, which he loves. He's openly gay and is surrounded by a life that he couldn't have designed any better for himself. The haters and those who think that he fabricated the whole thing continue to lobby for him to be removed. One of them said this: "I don't want a spiritual leader who can't even tell the simple story of his life. This story has so many holes in it, it makes me ask, is he lying? Is he mentally unstable? This is not the person you want leading you in your church. What kind of man deserts his child? But did he? Or is James Simmons telling the truth? What we know is that James Simmons isn't going anywhere. He is in that church for life. The elder who hired him, who interviewed him and threw that party where he could first tell his story, says this: if you don't believe James Simmons, then you're left with some pretty disturbing thoughts about our senior pastor. And not believing him means that you think he is a pathological liar, a false teacher, and a very sad, troubled man. I do not believe this to be the case. And so ends the story. What do you think? Faker? Or is it real? Is he one of those cases of amnesia where it just, it is just that his whole entire wife, hello, that his whole entire life has just been erased? Well, wife has been erased also. Yeah. Was he just wanting out of that life? Was he wanting to cast off the shackles of a wife and a baby and get himself to Dallas where he could be like, I'm coming out, I want the world to know? Or is it true? Who knows? Those three little things that I mentioned in the beginning, in the introduction, the 24, sorry, I think it's someone else's teeth in tonight. The 24-year-old man who walked into the hospital and announced that he had misplaced his aeroplane. True story. Yep, happened in London. This guy did actually get his full memory back. What happened was he was on a bike. He came off his bike when he collided with a car and had a brain injury. And for about 2 years of his life had no clue who he was, where he was, could remember bits, pieces, some faces were familiar to him, but in that time was also convinced that he was a pilot and that he had an aeroplane that he had parked in a London hospital. The 64-year-old woman, who I said was in the hospital bed when the visitor stopped by and she began to scream, and the visitor was her daughter, she was suffering from, I've completely forgotten the name of it now, but it's the condition which sometimes gets crossed with amnesia, where you begin to believe that everyone in your life is an imposter, or that basically your life is a setup, that everyone around you has been like almost essentially staged to be there, and this 64-year-old woman was in, that's what she believed. She believed that the people around her were, her entire family were staged, that nothing was in fact real. And the 34-year-old husband, who looked at his wife of 10 years and asked what is her name, is completely true. It's Oliver Sacks, who wrote a brilliant book. If you are interested in the sort of neuroscience or these sort of strange stories, the brilliant book, I mean, so many of you will have heard of it, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, is fucking brilliant. It is so good. And Oliver Sacks tells this story in here. And that is one of the cases of someone who just woke up and went, I have no idea who I am, where I am. I don't recognise a thing. So it can happen. I'm not saying it doesn't ever happen. I'm just saying that the story of James Simmons is a little bit peculiar. Okay. Alrighty, that's it from me. I'm out of here. As always, Join the Facebook group. Say hi on Twitter. Say hi on Instagram. Just say hi. Okay, until the next and final episode of Bodies and Brains, go well. Sending my love. Okay. Goodbye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face, let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over. Let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over.